I'm John Batchelor. Steve Cohen of New York University is here with me, and we're discussing Ukraine crisis now from Vladimir Putin's point of view, the president of Russia. I'm told Russian media is making it very clear to the Russian people, and they are incensed at the threats to Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. Steve, in your article, Cold War Again, Who's Responsible? You've identified the immediate future that would settle this for Vladimir Putin and the Ukrainians. It would look very much like a confederation, that is, individual parts of Ukraine, eastern, western, Crimea, all those having governances that were not independent, but then again are not directed by Kiev, and turn Ukraine into something like a neutral state, not unlike Finland during the Cold War. Is that satisfactory to Putin, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think we need a refinement from what you said, but let me just refer back to my article, which was published last week in The Nation and is at thenation.com. I had in front of me, when I wrote the article, the negotiating points that the Russian Foreign Ministry had issued almost a month ago on March 17th that were largely ignored in the West, but now have been taken up as a possible agenda if they sit down in Geneva the day after tomorrow, on Thursday. It's a big if. Now, the Russian bottom line for a negotiated settlement, and mind you, depending on your perspective, a negotiated settlement is either more likely or less likely because of the military operations taking place in Ukraine at the moment. But here's the bottom Russian line. An end of NATO expansion to any and all remaining former republics of the Soviet Union, primarily Ukraine, but also the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. That is the bottom line. The Russians will not sign off on anything else because for Russia, this whole crisis in Ukraine, beginning in November, was about bringing Ukraine into NATO. The Russians want that off the table forever. Secondly, they do want a stable Ukraine because it's a neighboring country, but also because the Russian economy, like the Ukrainian economy, is heavily dependent on Russian-Ukrainian trade. Heavily, heavily, heavily dependent. In order to stabilize Ukraine, according to the Russians, and they're not alone, and here's where we have to revise what you said a bit. Russia is calling for a new Ukrainian constitution that would be a federal constitution. And they point to the United States. The central government would have powers. The states, called regions or oblasti in Ukraine, would have powers. And the problem is that the Russian proposal sounds too much like what you just called it, a confederation, not a federation. Because in a confederation, the central government has almost no power. It's not even clear who collects taxes, who recruits the army. So confederation would result in a very unstable Ukraine, and the critics of this idea are right in saying that it would leave Ukraine at the mercy of both Russia and Europe. Each would take its chunk. But a real federation, where the central government in Kiev had substantial power, but the components of Ukraine, which are fundamentally different, politically, we've talked about this, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, would have more local autonomy. For example, under the current constitution, all the governors of the regions of Ukraine are not elected. I repeat, they are not elected. They are appointed by the government, the president, or the parliament in Kiev. Eastern Ukraine doesn't want this outcome. It wants to elect its own governors. So does Western Ukraine, for that matter. So that is a reasonable discussion. It's not confederation. The Russians are asking for too much local autonomy. For example, in the Russian proposal, there's even a line that the regions could decide with whom they wanted to have foreign relations. You can't take that away from the federal government. You wouldn't have a unitary state of any kind. But there's a lot of bargaining room there. So I think that is, along with non-alignment, along with continuing economic relations with Russia, Putin's three bottom lines. And I see no reason in the world why variations on that do not constitute a reasonable alternative to war. None whatsoever. Now, before I stop on this point, John, imagine what the alternatives are as we talk tonight. One is a negotiated, federated Ukraine, where all three parties are reasonably satisfied, East, West, and Ukraine. The second is civil war.
Right.
The third is war between Russia and the United States. And the fourth is a partitioned Ukraine, a very real possibility, where it turns out that Ukraine cannot be held together and will have to become two states, East and West. The problem with that is, what do you do about central Ukraine, which religiously, ethically, linguistically is such a mix that nobody would know where to draw the line. But there are these real possibilities, not theoretical, but rooted in existing circumstances today, and that's what's at stake as we discuss the issue and as the story goes forward.
Alexander Turchinov, who is the interim president of Ukraine, has made his choice, Steve. It's not a potential for him. It's a fact. He's launched armed men to attack people who are called citizens who are protesting that they have a right to conduct their own affairs. The People's Republic of Donetsk, I watched a video over the weekend. It looked like a reproduction of the Smolny Institute. They did their history very well once upon a time. Now, in Russia right now, on the television, all night, you watch this, Steve, you can understand the Russian. I have to read it in translation. The presentation is that fascists and extremists are attacking honest working people who only want the best for their families. And there are photographs everywhere of armored personnel carriers with flags waving and heavily armed men rolling towards Slavyansk. Now, Steve, it's too late for negotiation. It looks like hysteria and reaction right now on the ground. And therefore, this idea that they can pull back to a federation, I think it's broken. I think that the blood is in the water.
I can't. Maybe I'm just a more optimistic personality, but I can't go there to say there's no longer space for negotiation. There's no longer, because this is what you're saying, I think, there's no longer the possibility of keeping Ukraine together.
Not for a central state, for a confederacy, yes, but not for a central state.
I don't know that we want to debate this, but I think a confederacy would also be the end of Ukraine. The countries, look, let's just back up 1 minute. What we have here are two different stories. The story Moscow is telling, you just told it, and the story Washington. Forget Europe now, because Europe's divided by all this, but Washington is speaking in one voice.
Just 30 seconds, and we'll come back after the break.
McCain, Obama, Kerry, everybody opens his mouth in Washington is saying that all the unrest in Ukraine is caused by Putin. That's what they're saying.
Right.
That obscures, it tells a lie about the fundamental reality that's caused the problems, that Ukraine is a profoundly divided country. That's the reality. But to say Putin's created all the conflicts is to obscure everything we have to deal with. And that's why, though the Russian story isn't too accurate either, the American story is simply detached from reality.
Professor Steve Cohen of New York University in Russian history at Princeton University. And when we come back, who's launched the tanks? Turchinov's launched the tanks. I'm John Batchelor.